Ma'am, I don't know who let you up here, but you have 10 seconds to get out before I call security. The words cut across the 40th floor boardroom before the city below had finished waking. For one breath, nobody moved. Not the chief financial officer straightening his cufflinks at the head of the long glass table. Not the two analysts frozen mid-pour at the coffee service along the wall. Not the young assistant in the doorway, a stack of folders pressed to her chest like a shield. And not Naomi Carter. She stood by the window with the gray Chicago morning at her back, a 54-year-old black woman in a charcoal suit cut so precisely it could only have been made for her. Her hair was swept into a low twist threaded with silver. Reading glasses hung from a thin chain at her collar. In her left hand she held a leather portfolio gone soft at the corners, and clipped to its cover was a slim fountain pen, black lacquer scratched along one side, an object that meant nothing to anyone else in that room and everything to her. Gregory Hale stood 3 feet away in a suit that cost more than some of his employees earned in a month. He was 59, broad through the shoulders, silver at the temples, with a kind of permanent half-tan that comes from golf courses and not from sunlight. His father's name was carved into the granite wall of the lobby 40 floors below. He had spent his whole life believing that name made every room he entered his. "I'm sorry," Naomi said. Her voice was even. "Have we met?" "No," Hale said. "And we're not going to. This is a private executive session. I don't know if you're lost or here for an interview or whoever sent you." His eyes moved over her once, quick and dismissive, the way a man checks a price tag he assumes is too high. "But you need to be on the other side of that elevator in the next 10 seconds. The room held its breath. Naomi had heard that tone before. She had heard it in courtrooms when opposing counsel turned to the older white man beside her and asked if he was the lead attorney. She had heard it in lobbies, where receptionists slid the visitor's log toward the person standing behind her. She had heard it across 30 years of being the most prepared person in the room and still being asked gently whether she was sure she was in the right place. She had built a life out of swallowing that tone and answering with results. But this morning was different. This morning she knew something Gregory Hale did not. She set the portfolio down on the glass table without hurry. The pen caught the overhead light. "You're Mr. Hale," she said. "Not a question, Gregory Hale, CEO of this company." He said it the way other men said their own names when they wanted you to feel small, "and you are leaving." When she didn't move, something flickered behind his eyes, not quite anger yet, but the irritation of a man unused to being made to wait. He reached for the black phone at the center of the table and lifted the receiver. "Last chance," he said. "Security's on the 2nd floor. They can be up here in 90 seconds, and trust me, they will not be gentle about walking you out in front of all these people." Naomi looked at the phone in his hand, then back at his face. She did not reach for her portfolio. She did not step toward the door. She simply waited, the way a person waits who has already read the last page of the book. At the far end of the table, the chief financial officer, a thin, careful man named Daniel Pierce, shifted in his seat. He had been on a 6 o'clock call that morning. He knew things Gregory had apparently chosen to forget. His mouth opened, then closed. The instinct to keep his head down had kept his head attached for 19 years, and old instincts die slow. Near the wall, one of the analysts had stopped pouring coffee entirely. The thin stream had overrun the cup and was spreading dark across the white saucer, and he did not notice, because he was watching the woman by the window the way you watch a building you suspect is about to come down. And in the doorway, the young assistant, Jasmine Reed, 26, 3 months on the job, felt her stomach drop straight through the 40th floor. Because Jasmine had spent the previous night in the legal department printing and collating the documents now sitting in the portfolio on that table. She had watched the signatures go on at 7 o'clock that morning. She knew exactly who the woman in the charcoal suit was. And she knew that Gregory Hale, in the space of 15 seconds, had just done something he could not take back. Jasmine's lips parted. The word "sir" formed somewhere in her throat. Then she remembered her probation period, her student loans, her mother's voice telling her not to make trouble in her first real job, and the word died where it was born. So no one spoke. No one told Gregory Hale to stop. No one told him that the woman he was throwing out of his boardroom had walked into that building at dawn, signed her name in black ink beside his company's future, and now owned the granite wall, the glass table, the 40th floor, and the chair he was so sure belonged to him. He thought he was removing a stranger. He had no idea he was firing himself. Gregory Hale set the receiver back into its cradle with a sharp little click. He had not dialed. He wanted her to hear the threat without him having to follow through, the way a man waves a gun he has no intention of firing, because the waving alone has always been enough. "I'm being patient," he said, though patience had left his face 2 sentences ago. "I don't know what arrangement you think you have, but this floor is restricted, board members and executive officers only." Naomi tilted her head slightly. The reading glasses on the thin chain swayed against her collar. "Then I'm exactly where I belong." A small sound came from the coffee service along the wall. The analyst who had been overpouring finally noticed the spreading stain on the saucer and set the carafe down too hard. The clatter made everyone in the room flinch except Naomi and the woman across from her at the table. That woman was Eleanor Witt, 61 years old, the longest-serving independent director on Hale Industries board, silver pageboy haircut, pearl earrings, a navy blazer that had survived 3 decades of corporate combat. Eleanor had not spoken since Naomi entered the room. She was watching the way a chess player watches a board when she has already seen the next 4 moves, and is only waiting to learn whether the other player will see them too. Eleanor knew. Of course she knew. She had been on the same 6 o'clock call as Daniel Pierce. She had signed the same confidentiality acknowledgement. She had spent the last 90 minutes wondering exactly how Gregory was going to take the news, and now she was watching him write the answer in real time, in front of witnesses, with a permanence she suspected he could not yet feel. "Gregory," Eleanor said. Her voice was dry, careful, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that the best warnings sound like suggestions. "Perhaps we should let the meeting begin before we ask anyone to leave." Hale turned to her, and the irritation he had been pointing at Naomi swung across the room. "Eleanor, with respect, this is not a board matter yet. This is a security matter. There's a woman in this room who was not invited, and—" "She may have been invited," Eleanor said quietly, "by someone other than you." That stopped him. Not because he understood, because he did not. And the not understanding was a new feeling on the 40th floor. Naomi watched the exchange without expression. She had spent her career reading rooms, and this one was beginning to separate into the 3 groups she had expected. The people who knew, the people who suspected, and the people, like Gregory, who still believed the morning belonged to them. "Mr. Hale," she said, and now her voice carried a fraction more weight, the way a judge's voice carries when the gavel has not yet come down but is already in the air. "Before you call security, I would like to ask you one question. I'm not answering questions from people who shouldn't be in this room. Then consider it a courtesy." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "When did you last read your own email?" The question landed strangely. Hale blinked. Behind him, Daniel Pierce closed his eyes for a half-second. The way a man closes his eyes when he sees a car about to run a red light and knows he is too far away to shout. "My email?" "Your corporate inbox, Mr. Hale. The one your assistant filters, the one the board uses when something cannot wait." "I don't see what my—" 6 o'clock this morning," Naomi said. "Your general counsel sent a message marked urgent. It was followed at 6:14 by a message from the chair of your board. At 6:41, the chief financial officer sent a third. You were copied on all 3. The silence that fell across the boardroom was the silence of a tide pulling out before a wave. Hale's hand moved, almost involuntarily, toward the inside pocket of his jacket where his phone lived. He stopped himself. To check now, in front of her, in front of Eleanor, in front of every junior in the room, would be to admit that a stranger knew the contents of his inbox better than he did. "I was on a flight from Aspen this morning," he said, and the sentence came out smaller than he meant it to. You haven't read them," Naomi finished. "I understand." She let the understanding sit there for a beat. She was not cruel. She did not enjoy this. But she had learned over 30 years that a man like Gregory Hale would not believe what was happening until he was given the exact moment in which his ignorance had become public. "Then, perhaps," Eleanor said gently from across the table, "we should give Mr. Hale a moment to read his messages before we proceed." Hale did not move. The phone stayed in his jacket. His pride had become heavier than his curiosity, and pride, when it grows that heavy, is almost always the last thing a man sets down. Instead, he looked back at Naomi. "Who," he said, "are you?" Naomi did not answer right away. She let the question hang in the air, because some questions had to be earned before they could be answered. She had watched men like Gregory Hale ask that question across 30 years of conference rooms. Who are you? Always with that same edge, that same disbelief that the answer might matter. She picked up the leather portfolio from the glass table. The pen clipped to its cover caught the light again. She did not open it. Not yet. My name, she said, is Naomi Carter. The name moved through the room differently to different ears. To Gregory Hale, it meant nothing. He searched it the way a man searches a face at a party, trying to remember whether he was supposed to know her. To Daniel Pierce, the chief financial officer, the name landed like a stone dropped into still water. His shoulders rose half an inch and stayed there. To Eleanor Witt, the name was already familiar, had been familiar since the first call 3 weeks ago, and she watched Gregory's face the way a doctor watches a patient who does not yet know the diagnosis. To Jasmine Reed, still frozen in the doorway with her stack of folders, the name was the answer to a question she had been carrying since dawn. Her shoulders dropped. Her grip on the folders loosened. She had spent the last hour praying she would not have to be the one to tell him. "Carter," Hale repeated. He tried the name in his mouth and found it ordinary. "Are you with one of the firms? Sidley? Kirkland? Because if you're here on behalf of a client, the proper protocol is, I am not here on behalf of a client, Mr. Hale." "Then on behalf of whom?" Naomi set the portfolio down again, slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberation she had once used in courtrooms before opening an envelope of evidence. "On behalf of myself," she said. The phone in Hale's inside pocket buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He ignored it again. Behind him, Daniel Pierce reached for his own phone, glanced at the screen, then placed it face down on the table without reading the message. Eleanor Witt did not even look at hers. She already knew what it said. "Mr. Hale?" Naomi said. "I'm going to give you a kindness you did not give me. I'm going to suggest gently that you read your messages before we go any further. I'm going to suggest you read them privately. I'm going to suggest you take 5 minutes in your office, with the door closed, and I will wait." The offer was generous, more generous than he deserved. Gregory Hale heard it as condescension. "I don't take instructions," he said, "from strangers in my boardroom. It isn't an instruction, it's a courtesy. And I don't need courtesies from people who shouldn't be standing where they're standing." Eleanor Witt closed her eyes briefly. Across the table, Daniel Pierce made a small sound that might have been a sigh, and might have been the beginning of a word he chose not to speak. Naomi nodded once, almost to herself. She had offered the door. He had refused it. From here, what happened next would not be her doing. It would be the room's. She opened the portfolio. The papers inside were thick, formal, the kind of documents that did not exist as drafts. They existed only after every comma had been argued over and every signature line had been notarized. The top sheet bore the seal of the Delaware Secretary of State. The page beneath it bore the letterhead of a law firm Gregory Hale recognized instantly because his own father had used them for 40 years. 3 weeks ago, Naomi said, her voice still even, still calm, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this sentence not for cruelty but for clarity. A tender offer was made for a controlling interest in Hale Industries. The offer was made through a holding company called Brightline Equity Partners. It was structured in a way that did not require public disclosure until the closing date. The closing date was this morning at 7 o'clock, in a conference room on the 38th floor of this building. Hale's face had not moved, but his hand, the one that had been resting on the back of the chair, had gone white at the knuckles. Brightline Equity Partners, Naomi said, is owned by a trust. The trust is mine. The room did not gasp. The room did something quieter than gasping. The room adjusted. Daniel Pierce sat back in his chair. The young analyst at the coffee service set down his cup. Jasmine Reed exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. Eleanor Witt did not move at all, because she had been ready for this moment since 6 o'clock, and readiness, when it has been carried long enough, looks almost like stillness. Naomi closed the portfolio. The soft sound of the leather was the only sound in the room. "As of 7:03 this morning, Mr. Hale," she said, "I own 58% of the voting shares of Hale Industries." She let that sit for one breath, then another. "I am not a stranger in your boardroom. You are a guest in mine." Gregory Hale did not speak. He could not. The sentence Naomi had laid on the glass table between them had taken something from his throat on the way through. The 40th floor had gone so quiet that you could hear the soft hum of the building's ventilation, the faint chime of an elevator arriving somewhere far below. the small mechanical breath of the city through the sealed windows. 40 floors down, taxis honked and buses braked, and people walked into other people's offices believing the world was the same shape it had been the day before. Up here, the shape had already changed. Hale's phone buzzed a third time inside his jacket. This time he heard it. This time the buzz sounded like a small accusation, a quiet "you should have read me," a reminder that everything Naomi was saying had been sitting in his inbox while he ate breakfast in the back of a town car and rehearsed the speech he had planned to give this morning. The speech about cost discipline, the speech about loyalty, the speech about how the company his father built would not survive the next decade unless every person in this room learned to follow orders without question. He had been so eager to give that speech that he had not read his email. "This is a joke," he said. The words came out without conviction. He heard himself say them and immediately wished he had not. Somebody is playing a game. Eleanor. Daniel, tell me this is a game." Eleanor Witt looked at him with the calm of a woman who had been waiting 2 hours to be asked. "It is not a game, Gregory." "Daniel." Daniel Pierce did not look up from the table. The filing went through at 7:03. "Greg, I was on the call, so was Eleanor. So was Marcus from legal. The board chair signed off at 6:58. We tried to reach you, your phone was off." "My phone was not off. Your phone was on airplane mode, sir," Jasmine said from the doorway. Every head in the room turned. Jasmine had not meant to speak. The words had escaped her before her probation period could catch them. Her face went the color of the carpet beneath her feet, but she did not look away. She had said the true thing out loud, and the saying of it had loosened something in her chest she had not known was tight. I noticed when I sent the 7 o'clock packet to your assistant," she said. "She told me your phone had been on airplane mode since you boarded the plane last night. She said you don't like to be interrupted on the flight. She said you check messages when you get to the office." Hale stared at her. He did not recognize her. He had walked past her desk every morning for 3 months and had never once learned her name. "And you are?" "Jasmine Reed, sir. Executive assistant in legal. I printed the closing documents last night." The fact landed differently than she expected. Hale did not snap at her. He did not dismiss her. He simply looked at her for a long second, the way a man looks at a small object he has stepped on without noticing, and then looked away. Even in defeat, his attention had a ceiling, and the ceiling did not include 26-year-old assistants in entry-level suits. Naomi noticed. She would remember. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice pulled the room back to its center. "I would like to make something clear. I did not come here this morning to humiliate you. I came here because at 9 o'clock, which is in 11 minutes, this board is scheduled to meet, and I intend to chair that meeting. I had hoped to introduce myself in a room that was already seated. I had hoped to extend my hand. I had hoped that the first words you and I exchanged would be professional ones." She paused. "You did not give me that opportunity." Hale's mouth opened. Whatever defense he had been building collapsed before it reached his tongue. "I asked you who let you up here," Naomi continued. "The answer, Mr. Hale, is that no one let me up here. I came up because the building belongs to me. I asked if we had met. The answer was no, and you used the no as a weapon. You did not ask my name. You did not ask my business. You did not look at the portfolio in my hand or the pen on its cover or the way I stood at the window of your boardroom as if I had been there before. You looked at me and you saw a problem to be removed." The pen on the portfolio caught the light again. Naomi's fingers brushed it once, the way a person touches a small charm before walking into something difficult. "That pen," she said quietly, "belonged to the first black partner at the firm where I started my career. He gave it to me the day I made partner myself. He said, 'Carry it into rooms where they do not expect you.'" She looked at Hale. "I have carried it into a great many rooms." The mention of the pen changed something in the room. Not for Gregory Hale. He did not hear it. His mind was still climbing back up from the 7:03 filing, still trying to find a ledge to grip. But for everyone else, the pen turned the morning from a transaction into a story, and stories were harder to dismiss than numbers. Eleanor Witt looked at the pen on the portfolio. She had served on 3 boards in her life and had watched 1,000 pens move across 1,000 contracts, and she understood that some objects carried weight that had nothing to do with what they wrote. The pen on Naomi's portfolio was scratched along one side. It had been carried. It had been used. It had been somewhere before this room. "Mr. Hale," Naomi said, and the formality in her voice was deliberate now. the kind of formality lawyers use to mark the difference between conversation and record. I am going to ask you to do one thing before this board meeting begins. He looked at her. There was nothing left in his face but a kind of tired confusion, the look of a man who had been driving a familiar road and discovered that the road had been moved overnight. I am going to ask you to take 5 minutes, she said. Walk to your office, close the door, read the 3 messages waiting in your inbox. When you have read them, you may decide how you wish to enter this meeting. You may come back as the outgoing chief executive of a company that has just been acquired, and you may do so with the dignity your father's name on the lobby wall deserves, or you may come back the way you stood here a moment ago, and I will allow the board to handle the rest. She paused. Either way, when you return to this room, you will not be its chairman. The kindness of the offer was not lost on Eleanor. It was, in fact, more generous than anything Gregory Hale had extended to a subordinate in 15 years. Naomi was offering him an exit door with his name still on it. Most acquirers, in Eleanor's experience, kicked the door open and dragged the previous occupant out by the collar. Hale did not move at first. Pride is a heavy coat. It takes time to set down. But the buzz in his pocket came a 4th time, and the 4th buzz was the one that broke him. He reached inside his jacket. He pulled out the phone. He did not unlock it in the room. He held it in his palm like a small animal that had bitten him, and then he turned, without a word, and walked out of the boardroom toward his office down the long carpeted hall. The door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. For a moment, no one in the boardroom moved. Then Daniel Pierce exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere beneath his shoes, and Eleanor Witt pulled out the chair at the head of the table, her chair now, the chair of the board occupied during transitions, and sat down with the small, grateful sigh of a woman who had been standing for longer than the morning had required. Ms. Carter, Eleanor said, would you care to sit? In a moment, Naomi said. I would like to thank a few people first. She turned to the analyst at the coffee service. He was a young man, maybe 28, named Trevor Lynn. He had been hired the previous summer. He had not said one word during the entire exchange. His coffee saucer was still dark with the spill. Mr. Lynn, she said. He startled. Yes, ma'am. You were the only person in this room who looked at me directly when Mr. Hale was speaking. Trevor blinked. He had not realized she had noticed. He had not, in fact, thought of his looking as a choice. He had simply not been able to look away. Something in his Midwest upbringing, something in the way his mother had raised him, had made it impossible to study the carpet while a woman his mother's age was being threatened with security. I didn't do anything, ma'am. You looked, Naomi said. Looking is not nothing. Looking is the first thing. Most people in rooms like this learn very early how not to. She turned to Jasmine Reed. Ms. Reed. Jasmine's grip tightened on her folders. You knew who I was the moment I stepped off the elevator. Yes, ma'am. You were afraid to say so. Yes, ma'am. You said so anyway, about the airplane mode. You did it in front of him. Jasmine's eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard, because she did not want to cry in her first real boardroom on her first real moment of being seen, and the not wanting was making it worse. I'm not asking you to apologize for the fear, Naomi said. Fear is honest. I am noting only that you spoke through it. That is a thing I will remember. She turned finally to Eleanor Witt, and the 2 women looked at each other across the long glass table with the quiet recognition of people who had been on opposite ends of a long telephone for 3 weeks and were meeting, at last, in person. Madam Chair, Naomi said. Madam Owner, Eleanor replied. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed office door, Gregory Hale was reading his email. Inside his office, Gregory Hale stood in the middle of the rug his father had brought back from Istanbul in 1979 and stared at the screen of his phone. The first message was from Marcus Bell, the company's general counsel. It was 3 lines long. Greg, closing went through at 7:03. Brightline now holds 58% voting. Per shareholder agreement, board chair has been notified. Call me before 9. The second was from Eleanor Witt. Gregory, please read Marcus's email before walking into the 9 o'clock. This is not a drill. E. The third was from Daniel Pierce. Greg, picking up your phone would help. He read the 3 messages twice. Then a 3rd time. The words did not become softer with repetition. They became, instead, more solid, the way a bruise becomes more solid the morning after the impact. He set the phone on the corner of his desk. He sat down in the leather chair his father had picked out 41 years ago. The chair had a small worn spot on the left armrest from where his father's wedding ring had rubbed against the leather while he made calls. Gregory had inherited the spot along with everything else. He had been careful, over the years, never to wear his own ring on the same hand, because he had not wanted to deepen the mark and lose the memory of the man who made it. He looked at the spot now. He thought about his father. His father had been many things: a hard man, a fair one mostly, a builder, a drinker in the last years. But his father Gregory realized with a flush of shame that started at the base of his neck and worked its way up to his hairline, would never, never have asked a stranger to leave a boardroom without first asking her name. His father had grown up loading freight in a Pittsburgh rail yard. His father had been thrown out of better rooms than this one before he learned to own them. His father had known what it cost to be looked at the way Gregory had just looked at Naomi Carter. His father would have been ashamed of him. The thought landed harder than Marcus's email. Gregory sat with it for a long minute. He was a man who had not sat with very many uncomfortable thoughts in his adult life. He had paid people to think them for him, paid other people to make them go away. The thought of his father's shame was not a thought he could outsource. He reached for the phone again and dialed Marcus. "Greg?" Marcus said. He sounded tired. He had been awake since 4. "Are you okay?" "Define okay. You read the email." "I read all 3. A pause. "Are you going to fight it?" It was a real question. Marcus had been on retainer for the Hale family for 20 years. He had drafted the trust that held Gregory's shares. He knew, better than Gregory did, the shape of the leverage that remained. There were calls Gregory could make. There were poison pills, statutory delays, court filings that could buy a week, maybe 2. The acquisition was clean, but cleanliness did not stop a determined man from throwing mud at it. Gregory looked at the worn spot on the armrest. "No," he said. "I'm not going to fight it." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Another pause. "Can I ask why?" Gregory thought about how to answer that. There were many answers. The legal answer was that the offer was too clean to break. The financial answer was that Brightline had paid a premium, and his shareholders would lynch him if he tried to undo it. The personal answer was that his father had loved this company more than he had loved most of the people in his life, and his father had loved it because it was the work, not because of who sat in which chair. But the answer that came out, the one that surprised him as it left his mouth, was simpler than any of those. "Because I just made it harder on her than it needed to be," he said, "and she didn't deserve that." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, who? The new owner. Naomi Carter. She's in the boardroom. She came up here to introduce herself, Marcus. She walked in with the papers in her hand, and I told her to get out before I called security. The silence on the other end of the line had a quality Gregory had not heard in 20 years of working with Marcus. It was not professional silence. It was personal silence. It was the silence of a man choosing his next sentence with the care of a friend. "Greg," Marcus said finally, "I want to tell you something. I've known Naomi Carter for 15 years. She was opposite me in a securities case in 2011. She is one of the 3 best lawyers I have ever stood across a table from. And she does not waste mornings. If she walked in there to introduce herself, she walked in to give you a soft landing. You understand?" "I understand." "Then go give her a real apology, not a press one, a human one." Gregory closed his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I will." He hung up. He stood. He straightened his tie in the dark reflection of the window. He looked at the worn spot on the armrest one more time. Then he walked out of the office and back down the long hallway toward the boardroom, where the woman who owned his life's work was waiting to be apologized to. The walk from Gregory Hale's office to the boardroom was 42 paces. He had measured it once years ago, on a slow afternoon, the way a man measures the length of his own kingdom. 42 paces of pale carpet, framed photographs of his father shaking hands with 3 different presidents, a small bronze of a locomotive his grandfather had cast in 1956. He had walked this hallway thousands of times. This morning it felt longer. He stopped outside the boardroom door. He could hear voices on the other side, low and steady, the murmur of a meeting that had not waited for him. He understood with a clarity that surprised him that the meeting would never wait for him again. He pushed the door open. The room had rearranged itself in his absence. Eleanor Witt sat at the head of the table. Naomi Carter sat to her right, the leather portfolio open in front of her, the scratched pen uncapped and resting beside a single sheet of paper. Daniel Pierce had moved one chair closer to the center. Trevor Lynn, the young analyst, had taken a seat along the wall with a notepad on his knee, no longer hovering by the coffee. Jasmine Reed was still in the doorway behind Gregory, but she was standing differently now, the folders lowered to her hip instead of clutched to her chest. Every head turned when he entered. No one rose. No one was supposed to. Gregory closed the door behind him and walked slowly to the empty chair on Naomi's left. He did not sit yet. He stood beside it and looked down the length of the table at the woman he had threatened to have removed by security 45 minutes earlier. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Mr. Hale, I owe you an apology." The room did not move. Naomi did not move. She watched him with the same calm she had brought through the door at dawn, the calm of a woman who had been preparing for this sentence for 30 years across 1,000 other rooms and had finally heard it in the right one. "I'm listening," she said. Gregory had practiced apologies in his life. Press apologies, regulatory apologies. The careful apologies executives offered after a quarter went badly, those apologies had a shape. They began with "we regret," moved through "we are taking steps," and ended with "we look forward to." They were structures, not statements. They had not required him to feel anything. This one did. "I looked at you when you came in," he said, "and I made a decision about who you were before you opened your mouth. I have been making that decision about people my whole career, and most of the time I have gotten away with it, because most of the time the people I made it about did not have the power to correct me. You did. That's not the part I'm apologizing for." A small intake of breath from somewhere along the wall. Trevor Lynn, probably. He had not expected the next sentence to land where it was landing. "I'm apologizing," Gregory said, "for the times I got away with it." Eleanor Witt's hand moved, almost involuntarily, to the pearl at her left earlobe. She had sat on 3 boards. She had heard a great many men explain themselves. She had not heard one say that sentence before. Naomi did not speak. She let him keep going because she could tell he was not finished, and because she had learned in courtrooms that the second half of an apology was usually the half that mattered. "My father built this company," Gregory said. "He started in a rail yard. He used to tell me a story about a foreman who wouldn't let him into the lunchroom because he had grease on his hands. He told that story like it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. He told it because he wanted me to remember what it felt like to be looked at the way that foreman looked at him." He paused. His voice had gone rough around the edges. "I forgot. I have spent 40 years forgetting. This morning I was the foreman, Ms. Carter, and I didn't even know I was holding the door." He stopped. He had said more than he meant to. He had said, in fact, the truest thing he had said out loud in a decade, and it had cost him something he could feel in his chest. The silence that followed was not the silence of judgment, it was the silence of witness. Naomi set the pen down. She closed the portfolio. She looked at Gregory Hale for a long moment, and what passed across her face was not forgiveness, because forgiveness was not hers to give in a single morning, but something adjacent to it. Recognition. The acknowledgement that a man had said the difficult sentence without being forced to. "Mr. Hale," she said, "sit down." He sat. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking me to pretend the morning didn't happen." It happened. It did. She looked around the table. Eleanor, Daniel, Trevor along the wall, Jasmine still in the doorway. The room had become, in the last 10 minutes, something none of them had walked into. A room with new air in it. "Now," Naomi said, "let's talk about the company." Naomi opened the portfolio again, but this time not to the closing documents. This time to a thinner stack, paper clipped along the top, a single page on the cover. "Before this morning," she said, "I spent 11 months studying this company. I read every quarterly filing for the last 15 years. I read your father's letters to shareholders going back to 1984. I read the union arbitration from 1996. I read the EEOC settlement from 2003. I read the safety report from the Memphis warehouse in 2018. She tapped the stack with one finger. "I know this company, Mr. Hale. I bought it because I know it. I did not buy it to gut it." Gregory listened. He had not expected this part. He had expected, after the apology, to be told the date of his separation, the size of his package, the wording of his press release. Acquirers did not usually open the meeting after the apology with a defense of the company they had just bought. "I bought it," Naomi continued, "because your father built something worth keeping. The locomotive parts division still has the best engineering team in the Midwest. The logistics arm is undervalued because the last 3 CFOs were afraid to invest in software. The Memphis warehouse is a problem, but it is a fixable problem. There are 9,000 people on this company's payroll, and the overwhelming majority of them do good work for a fair wage. I did not buy this company to put them on the street. Daniel Pierce, halfway down the table, lifted his eyes. He had been bracing for the layoff speech. Every CFO braced for the layoff speech. He had drafted 3 different versions of the cost-cutting memo on the flight back from Aspen the night before, depending on which of the rumored buyers turned out to be real. He had not drafted a version of "we did not buy this company" to gut it. "What I did buy it to do," Naomi said, "is change how it is run. Not the products, not the headcount, the culture. The culture, Mr. Hale, that allowed a senior executive to threaten a stranger with security inside of 15 seconds without a single person in the room finding the courage to stop him." A faint flush rose along Gregory's collar. He did not look away. "That is not your culture alone," Naomi said. "It is a culture this company has carried for 40 years. It has lived in the hallways. It has lived in the hiring decisions. It has lived in the way the cafeteria on the 12th floor is full of one kind of face and the loading dock on the 2nd floor is full of another. It has lived in the fact that the 26-year-old assistant who knew the truth this morning was afraid to say it out loud, and the fact that a junior analyst at the coffee service felt brave for looking at me. That is not a culture I am willing to inherit without changing." Eleanor Witt nodded once. She had been on this board for 9 years. She had filed 2 formal complaints in that time and watched both of them disappear into the kind of investigation that ended without conclusions. She had stopped filing complaints in 2021. She had not stopped noticing. "Here is what is going to happen," Naomi said. "Effective today, I am chair of this board and chief executive of this company. Eleanor Witt has agreed to serve as lead independent director. Daniel Pierce will remain in his role as CFO, pending the same evaluation every officer will undergo over the next 90 days. Daniel's shoulders, which had been rising slowly through the morning, finally dropped half an inch. "Mr. Hale, you will not remain as chief executive. That is not negotiable, and I think you already understand why." "I understand, but," Naomi said, "I am not removing you from the company." Gregory's head came up. "Your father's name is on the lobby," she said. "Your knowledge of the locomotive parts division is genuine. I am offering you a position as senior advisor to the office of the chief executive for the next 18 months. You will report to me. You will have no operational authority. You will sit in on the strategic reviews of the divisions you know best, and you will teach the people coming up behind you what your father taught you about the work. At the end of 18 months, we will evaluate whether the arrangement has been useful. If it has not, we will part on respectful terms. If it has, we will discuss what comes next." The offer landed in the room like a stone in still water. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted a quarter inch. Daniel's mouth opened and then closed. Trevor Lynn, along the wall, had stopped writing. It was not a generous offer in the way a press release would describe it. It was a generous offer in the way that mattered. It allowed Gregory Hale to stay in the building. It allowed him to walk past his father's name on the granite wall every morning without feeling that he had been thrown out of it. It allowed his apology, the real one he had given 5 minutes earlier, to be the beginning of something rather than the end. Gregory looked at Naomi for a long moment. "Why?" he said. The word came out smaller than he meant it to. Naomi capped the pen. The small click of the cap was the only sound in the room. "Because punishment," she said, "is not the same as change. And I am not in the business of punishment, Mr. Hale. I am in the business of change." Gregory Hale accepted the offer. He did not accept it gracefully at first, because grace is not a muscle that develops overnight, and a man does not learn in one morning what he has avoided for 40 years. He accepted it the way most people accept difficult gifts. He nodded. He said thank you in a voice that did not quite carry. He looked down at the table because looking up was, for the moment, more than he could manage. But the acceptance was real. And Naomi, who had watched a great many men say thank you in a great many rooms, could tell the difference between the kind that was a placeholder and the kind that was a beginning. The board meeting that followed lasted 47 minutes. The shareholder vote had already happened on paper at dawn, so the meeting was a ratification, not a battle. Eleanor Witt chaired with the dry efficiency of a woman who had been waiting a decade to chair anything. The vote on Naomi's appointment was unanimous. The vote on Gregory's new role was unanimous. The vote on a 90-day operational review across every division was unanimous. By 9:47 the morning had been formalized, and the new shape of the company had been written into the minutes. When the meeting ended, people stood slowly. There was an awkwardness to the standing, the awkwardness of a room that had walked through something larger than it had been scheduled for. Daniel Pierce gathered his papers with hands that were steadier than they had been an hour earlier. Eleanor Witt removed her reading glasses and folded them with the small smile of a woman who had already decided how she was going to tell this story to her husband over dinner. Naomi remained seated. She watched the room empty. She had not yet decided whether the watching was sentiment or strategy. Maybe both. Trevor Lynn, the young analyst, hesitated at the door. He looked at her, then at the carpet, then back at her. "Ma'am?" "Yes, Mr. Lynn. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" He thought about it for a moment, honestly. The way a young man thinks about a sentence he has not rehearsed. "For naming it," he finally said. "The looking. I didn't know it was a thing until you said it was a thing. I thought I was just doing what everybody does." Naomi smiled then, not the careful smile she had used for 30 years. A different one. "Mr. Lynn," she said, "most people are not doing what everybody does. Most people are doing what is easier. You looked because you couldn't not look. That's worth something. Don't let this company train it out of you." He nodded, lost for a reply, and slipped out. Jasmine Reed was the last to leave. She had not moved from the doorway since the meeting began. She had taken notes she would later realize she did not need to take, because the moments would live in her without ink. She approached the table now with the folders still on her hip and the careful posture of a young woman who did not yet trust the floor she was standing on. "Ms. Carter." "Ms. Reed, I want to apply for something." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Apply? I don't know what it's called yet. I don't know if it exists, but I'd like to work for you, directly. Not as a coffee assistant, I don't know, as whatever the version of me is that gets to say airplane mode out loud the next time." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the leather portfolio, pulled out a single business card, heavy stock, no logo, just a name and a phone number in plain black ink, and slid it across the table. "Call that number Monday morning at 9, she said. "Ask for Helena. Tell her I sent you. We'll find the version of you that gets to say things out loud." Jasmine's eyes filled properly this time, but she did not look away. She took the card. She held it the way Naomi had held the scratched pen. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Naomi said. "The work is harder than the morning was." Jasmine nodded. She left. The boardroom was empty. Naomi sat alone at the long glass table with the pale Chicago morning brightening behind her. She picked up the pen. She turned it once in her fingers the way she had 1,000 times. The scratch along the side caught the light. She thought about the man who had given it to her. Walter Green, partner at Green and Walsh, the first black man to make partner at that firm in 1967, dead now 16 years. She thought about the day he had pressed the pen into her palm and said, in that low gravel voice, "Carry it into rooms where they do not expect you." She had carried it into a courtroom in Tulsa in 1998. She had carried it into a Senate hearing in 2007. She had carried it into a federal appeals court in 2014. She had carried it through 3 decades of doors that had opened slowly or not at all. This morning it had carried her too. She capped the pen. She slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket, where her hand could find it without looking. She rose from the table. The 40th floor was hers now. The building, the granite wall, the chair at the head of the long glass table. She walked to the window and looked out at the city she had just bought a piece of, and for the first time all morning she allowed herself to exhale. 18 months later, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, the 40th floor boardroom looked almost the same. The long glass table was still there. The pale carpet. The framed photograph of the first Hale locomotive, restored and rehung at Naomi's request, because she had meant what she said about not gutting what was worth keeping. The granite wall in the lobby downstairs still carried the Hale name. Gregory Hale's father had built something worth carrying forward, and Naomi had carried it. But the room had changed in ways a visitor would not notice until they sat in it for a while. The faces around the table were different. Trevor Lynn sat 2 chairs down from the head, no longer hovering by a coffee service. He had been promoted to Director of Strategic Analysis in the 11th month, and he had earned it twice over. Jasmine Reed sat directly to Naomi's right. 28 years old now, with the title of Chief of Staff, stitched into the door of an office she had never imagined occupying. Daniel Pierce was still the chief financial officer, but the version of him that sat at the table now spoke more and apologized less. Eleanor Witt had retired from the board the previous spring, on her own terms, with a standing ovation from a room that had finally learned to applaud her on time. And Gregory Hale was there too. He sat at the far end of the table, in the chair reserved for the senior advisor. His suit was the same charcoal he had worn the morning his world rearranged itself. He spoke when called on. He listened more than he spoke. He had developed. Over the 18 months, the small, careful habit of looking at the person who was speaking, really looking the way Trevor Lynn had looked at Naomi on that first morning. It was not a habit he had been born with. It was a habit he had been taught, and the teacher had been the woman at the head of the table. His evaluation was scheduled for the following week. Naomi had not yet decided what she would recommend. She suspected she would extend the role another year. Gregory, when she had hinted at it the previous Friday, had said only thank you, and the thank you had carried the same weight as the one he had given her after the apology. The kind that meant something. There were other changes too, the kind that did not show up in boardroom seating charts but showed up everywhere else. The dignity standard Naomi had built at Crestview. No, that was a different story, a different airline, a different mother in a different seat. This dignity standard, the one Naomi and her team had written for Hale Industries, had been adopted in the 3rd month and audited at the 12th. It did not begin with policy. It began with a sentence painted on the wall of the new employee orientation room in plain black letters. People know when they are being measured instead of welcomed. The cafeteria on the 12th floor and the loading dock on the 2nd floor looked different now, not transformed. Naomi did not believe in transformation in 18 months, but different. Promotions had been audited. Hiring panels had been restructured. The Memphis warehouse problem had been a real problem and had taken 9 months and a settlement to address. But it had been addressed honestly, with the people who had been harmed at the table where the addressing happened. The company had lost 2 executives in the first 6 months who had not wanted to be measured by the new standard. Naomi had let them go without a press release. The company had also kept many more who had not known, until the standard was named, that they had been waiting all their careers for someone to name it. Naomi rose now from her chair at the head of the table. The Tuesday meeting was ending. People gathered their papers. The room exhaled the small, contented exhale of a room that had done its work. She walked to the window. The Chicago morning, gray and steady, brightened over the lake. Her hand found the pen in her inside pocket, the way it always did when a moment asked to be remembered. The scratch along the side was a little deeper now. The pen had been carried through more rooms. Behind her, Jasmine paused in the doorway. "Ma'am, your 9:30 is here." "Send her in." "Give us a minute first." "Yes, ma'am." Naomi stayed at the window for that minute. She thought about Walter Green and the rail yard in Pittsburgh and her own father, who had been a postal carrier in Gary, Indiana, and had walked 12 miles a day for 31 years without once being asked his name by the people whose mail he carried. She thought about the morning Gregory Hale had told her to get out, and the morning 18 months later when he had quietly, in front of the same board, voted to ratify her chairmanship for another 5-year term. She thought about the silence in the boardroom that first morning, the silence of the people who had looked away. The silence Jasmine had broken when she said airplane mode in a voice barely above a whisper, and the silence Trevor had broken simply by refusing to look at the carpet. Silence had a cost. She had spent 30 years learning to name it. She turned from the window. The next meeting waited. The work was harder than the morning. The work was always harder than the morning. She walked to the door, the pen warm in her pocket, ready. If this story moved you like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to say the true thing out loud. And comment these 3 words below: dignity changes everything.